What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to College Football Talk with Peter Burtnett, bringing you the much anticipated previews for the college football playoff semifinals. I'm going to be starting out with the number 1 versus number 4 matchup, the Michigan Wolverines against the Alabama Crimson Tide. But before I dive into this matchup, if you go on to enjoy this video, please feel free to leave a like, consider subscribing to the channel, and turn on those post notifications so you're always up to date whenever I post. But without further ado, let's dive into this matchup. It is perhaps the most decorated matchup and the highest stakes that we've seen in college football, potentially ever. That might be a stretch, but it certainly is way up there in the ranks of college football games that just had so much deeper meaning behind them. What you're seeing at the Rose Bowl, the cathedral of college football, the best stadium in college football with the most history, is the two teams with the most history. You've got the winningest team of all time with the Michigan Wolverines, I think 1,002 wins all time now after the Big Ten championship win over Iowa, against the Alabama Crimson Tide with somewhere around 966. I'll make sure I get that number right when I edit this video. And two of the teams that claim the most national championships, Alabama with 18 and Michigan with 11. So much history for both of these programs. Heisman Trophy winners and so many historic coaches over the years. These two teams are what make college football what it is. And this matchup in the Rose Bowl has a lot to unpack. So let's dive into it, starting, as always, with these sort of deep dive roster breakdowns with the quarterback position. You've got J.J. McCarthy. He's been one of the most efficient quarterbacks in college football this season. He's thrown for 2,600 yards, 19 touchdowns, and 4 interceptions. He's also rushed for 57 yards, 157 rushes for 146 yards and 3 touchdowns. The question for him to answer is, can he throw against the Alabama secondary? Who exactly is J.J. McCarthy going to be going up against when he passes the ball? Well, first of all, you have two of the best cornerbacks in college football in Terrion Arnold and Kool-Aid McKinstry. Arnold has 11 pass deflections, which is up there among the best in college football. I'll pop up the numbers of ranking DBs with pass deflections this season. Certainly up there, and he also has 5 interceptions to pair with that. And then Kool-Aid McKinstry, I feel like going into this season was a bit more higher in draft boards and, all like the hype and everything going into the season. He has still had a phenomenal season. I imagine some of the stats like a pass deflection and interception don't tell the full story. I'll see if I could find some of these numbers, but I imagine the stats in terms of receiving yards against him are very, very low. I'm not saying he's a perfect cornerback, but he is one of the best in college football. And statistically, he has 7 pass deflections and has had a phenomenal season as well. A couple of other guys. At the star position is Malachi Moore. He has 4 pass deflections and interception. Also a DB, Trey Amos. And then in the back end of the secondary, Caleb Downs, who is also the Crimson Tide leading tackler with 99 total this season, and free safety Jalen Key. So those are the guys that make up the Alabama secondary, which is kind of upper end, middle of the pack. They're not to a level where a Michigan is, or a defense like a Penn State or Ohio State in terms of how they, in terms of points per game allowed, yards per game allowed. But I don't think that always tells the full story. Or in Alabama, even still ranks 17th fewest in points per game and 18th fewest in yards per game allowed. So McCarthy is going to have his hands full, but he has some really good weapons to help with that I think get a little bit overlooked. Roman Wilson is obviously the main target, 41 receptions, 662 yards, 11 touchdowns. And then I think, though, there's 2 guys who go a little bit under the radar, and they're actually right around Roman Wilson in terms of catches. You've got tight end Colston Loveland, 40 receptions, 572 yards, 4 touchdowns, and Cornelius Johnson, 42 for 567 and a touchdown. So those 3 guys are all pretty comparable in terms of the production that they have, and they make this a very balanced Michigan passing attack. In the back stretch of the season, though, they have not passed the ball very much, and McCarthy's numbers have dipped. I think part of that is the quality of opponent that they've faced, but I think ultimately probably second to Ohio State's defense is the Alabama Crimson Tide defense, and Iowa is also very comparable to those 3 defenses. and the offense hasn't had the same level of production, but they've done what it takes to get the wins when they need to. And so for this Michigan passing attack, I think number one, they're going to have to be able to get passes on the outside going up against those two cornerbacks. And I think also, though, if that's not working, a player like Loveland kind of getting over the middle of the field, kind of picking up those chunk plays that, are maybe thrown underneath, a little check down, stuff like that. And a couple other guys to watch, AJ Barner and then Donovan Edwards. The two of them have combined for 52 receptions and for just shy of 500 yards, and they have one touchdown combined, so not a lot, but those are a couple of other options for McCarthy to pass to. Then flipping the script, looking at the Alabama passing game, you've got Jalen Milroe, who's a little bit less efficient throwing the ball, 171 for 261, throwing for 2,700 yards, 23 touchdowns, 6 interceptions. And he adds more of a dual threat, obviously, 140 rushes, 468 yards, 12 touchdowns. I say obviously because we saw that on display in the SEC championship game, especially when the Crimson Tide needed it to seal that conference championship win over the Georgia Bulldogs. And so what Milroe is able to do is he's able to provide those big plays. You look at 4th and 31 against Auburn in the Iron Bowl, where Alabama is down to its final chance in the game, 4th and goal from the 31, and he delivers a perfect pinpoint pass. For Milroe, though, he has that big playability. He's a little bit more prone to mistakes. You could see that in the incompletions and also 2 more interceptions than McCarthy. And he certainly has had a journey to get here. Early in the season, certainly wasn't going the way that he would have hoped, but he was able to turn it around even after getting, sitting the bench for that game against South Florida earlier this year. Milroe has turned things around and put himself really into the Heisman running, I think finishing inside the top 6 in the final Heisman voting, I believe, maybe top 7. He was right in there in consideration, just missed out on going to New York. So he has really turned things around, but he goes up against potentially, I would say the best defense and thus probably one of, if not the best secondaries in college football. And it's led by cornerback Will Johnson, who is a just multifaceted defender who is really good at getting his hand in there. He's very good at man-to-man coverage and does a fantastic job for the Wolverines secondary. Mike Sainristil has also done a phenomenal job. I think Johnson has 3 or 4 interceptions this year, and Sainristil has at nickelback, I think 5 interceptions this year. So both of them are able to get key interceptions, and that's the matchup to look. It's how they're able to read Milroe's eyes and potentially make big plays for the Wolverines defense. The other cornerbacks that get considerable playing time are Josh Wallace and Quentin Johnson, and then in the back end, strong safety Makari Page and free safety Rod Moore, who had the game-sealing interception in the win over Ohio State. So this secondary kind of leads the way at the back end, but they have, if there's one weakness, maybe it just shows the strength of Maryland and Ohio State, but comparably to how things went the rest of the year, both of those offenses put up the most points. I think Michigan hadn't allowed more than 13 before giving up 24 to both the Terrapins and the Buckeyes, and both Buckeyes and Terrapins combined to throw for 518 yards. So I think if there is a question mark, it is a little bit in this Michigan secondary, but then you look at the skill set of guys like Will Johnson, like Rod Moore, and like Mike Sainristil. I think it shows that they have a lot of skill. It's just a matter of if they're able to limit the Alabama passing game. But I think the key thing also for both of these passers is going to be the protection that they get, and that's been a little bit more of a concern for Alabama. The Crimson Tide have allowed 43 sacks this season. At the same time, the offensive line paves the way for 4.3 yards per carry, which is actually the same for both teams. They average as a team 4.3 exactly on the dot. So that's obviously a very good number to have because you're rushing for 4 yards per carry. That means you're always going to be getting first downs even if you just run the ball. So that's a good thing. And then for Michigan, this season as a whole, they've done a fantastic job at protecting McCarthy in the pocket. The loss of Zach Zinter, though, I think could be a factor in this one because in the Big Ten championship win over Iowa, they allowed 4 sacks. In the previous 12 games in the entire season, they had allowed just 14, and then they allow 4 in that game. Obviously, the Hawkeyes' defense is one of the best in the country, so that's certainly a part of it. But you have to wonder if the loss of Zinter, who does a phenomenal job in pass protection and blocking in general, but especially in pass protection, you have to wonder if some guys like a Dallas Turner, who has 9 sacks for the Crimson Tide, or a Chris Braswell, 8 sacks, Justin Eboigbe, who has 7 sacks, and then Deontay Lawson, Tresman Marshall are a couple of guys with 2.5 sacks or more. The team as a whole has 38 sacks, which is 5 more than what Michigan has. So I think if there's one area, obviously you look statistically, Alabama has allowed more than 2 times the amount of sacks that Michigan has allowed, but I think Michigan might be a little bit more at risk for 2 reasons. One, the loss of Zinter is obviously a huge load to bear, not having him in pass protection, a very experienced player who had something like, I think 40 or 50 starts for the Wolverines, basically a 4-year starter. It was a huge loss in the Ohio State game. They were still able to rally and win that game. But I think when you're looking at the way Alabama can rush the passer and create a lot of pressure, even if Arnold and McKinstry are able to stay with the Michigan receivers, then give the rushers, the edge rushers and linebackers and the interior linemen enough time to get to the quarterback. And some of the other guys to keep an eye on, kind of in that interior, Tim Keenan III, Jaheim Otis, and Tim Smith are a couple of D tackles. Keenan is a nose tackle for the Crimson Tide, so They kind of have a lot of guys who are there who can create havoc for the opposing offensive line. But at the same time, Michigan does a really good job of rushing the passer as well. There's a reason that they've gotten to this point, that they're number 1 in the country, 13-0, and that's because they've had 33 sacks. So maybe it's not as much showing as Alabama. They're not far behind, only 5 fewer sacks. Jalen Harrell is obviously the main guy to watch. We saw that in the Ohio State game. He had pressure on that final play that sealed the deal when Rod Moore got the interception. 6.5 sacks this year, 2 forced fumbles. So if you're able to create a turnover, that could be huge. Josiah Stewart, 4.5 sacks, and also has 2 pass deflections. Derek Moore with 4 sacks and 2 pass deflections. So look for Stewart and Derek Moore to potentially be getting their hands into passing lanes and creating problems for Milroe. Mason Graham and Braden McGregor, 2 edge rushers who are able to, either come up and rush on the edge or drop back into coverage. So those are some of the other guys. And then some of the other names to watch. Kenneth Grant has 2.5 sacks. And then Michael Barrett, the weak side linebacker, and Sainristil, still already mentioned him, are kind of those second level guys that can create pressure as well. So that's the outlook, and then kind of a final look. We'll round it out for the defenses because I started talking about the linebackers. For Michigan, from what I see on the depth chart and seeing, I'd have to look a little bit more at film, and maybe I will, and I'll put in some comments on the screen if there's anything that changes with this. But based on their formation, it's kind of a 4-2-5, but it can also be, it's flexible, it can change, but they have typically, the 4 guys on the line of scrimmage, couple of linebackers, maybe they have one of the edges drop back, but overall it's kind of a 4-2-5, and then they have 5 guys in the secondary with the 2 cornerbacks, nickelback, Sainristil, and the strong safety and free safety. For Alabama, it's more of a 3-3-5. They have 3 guys, kind of a variety of options that they can go with there. And then strong side linebacker is Dallas Turner, who I think is probably the best, outside linebacker in the country. And then opposite him on the weak side is Deontay Lawson. Mentioned him earlier. He has, he's one of the guys for Alabama that has 2.5 sacks or more. And then middle linebacker Tresman Marshall, also mentioned him, one of the top tacklers there in the middle of the field, leading the Crimson Tide defense. So again, more of a 3-3-5. They have kind of a position that is somewhat similar as being a guy who's versatile, the versatility of a defender in the star position, and that is, mentioned his name earlier, Malachi Moore. And so Alabama's defense can prevent a variety of different things. Again, they're not statistically to the same level as Michigan, but I think the way that the Alabama defense is always coached, I think there's definitely a lot of guys who can create problems for the Michigan offense. But perhaps the biggest strength for both of these teams, actually, and I think maybe it goes a little bit more under the radar for Alabama, potentially, is their ground game. And starting with Michigan, obviously you've got Blake Corum, one of the best running backs in college football, 218 rushes for 1,028 yards and 24 touchdowns. Michigan's single-season record, 4.7 yards per carry, and then he's backed up by Donovan Edwards, 109 carries, 382 yards, 3 touchdowns. And then one other guy who's gotten a fair amount of carries, Khalil Mullings. Those three have created a powerful punch. Obviously, Corum leads the way. He's the bell cow. He's the guy who's going to get most carries in this game. But Edwards is a guy who can break off a big run like he has previously last year against Ohio State, and can provide kind of an opportunity for Corum to potentially get a breather for a play or two. On the flip side, Jason McClellan, he's actually 0.1 yard per carry better than Corum. He has fewer rushes, so that's I imagine part of it. 166 for 803 and 6 touchdowns. So on the ground, Alabama, it shows with Milroe having 4 more passing touchdowns and 9 more rushing touchdowns than McCarthy. So the touchdowns for Alabama come from a variety of places, but the yardage, McClellan is able to get almost 5 yards per carry, which you look at that, if he's a little bit over that average, 2 plays and it's a first down for Alabama. So if he can keep that going, maybe even take it a step up in this game, it's going to be tough against that Michigan line and linebackers, but if he can do that, that would be key. And then a little bit more of a big time second option is Roydell Williams. He has really good numbers in yards per carry. I think his would be right around 5 yards per carry, 110, 561, and 5 touchdowns. And then Jam Miller is another option, and already mentioned the legs of Jalen Milroe. I think Alabama's rushing attack is a little bit more multifaceted. There's really, I would say, 3 main guys, and then Jam Miller's a guy who maybe will get a carry here and there, so you never know if he could break off a big run or just punch one in at the goal line or something like that. But Alabama's rushing attack is certainly more dynamic. I think Michigan's is a bit stronger, but they do depend more on one guy, that being Corum. I think if I had to give an advantage, I would give running backs to Michigan, but I think Alabama is right there, pretty even with them. Real quick, I'm going to go through this, who I would give the edge to at each of these positions that I've mentioned and gone through. I think quarterback, a very slight edge just because of the dynamism, I think is how you pronounce that, the dynamic play of Jalen Milroe at quarterback, the ability to run and pass the ball, and how he's really worked on some things that he struggled with early in the season to become a really incredible player. Running back to Michigan. I think wide receivers, and actually I haven't touched on these guys yet. I did for Michigan, but Milroe's main targets, Jermaine Burton, 35 catches for 777 yards, 8 touchdowns. Isaiah Bond, the guy who caught the game-winning touchdown against Auburn, 44 for 621 and 4 touchdowns. Tight end Amari Niblack, 19 for 321, 4 touchdowns. And then one other guy is Kobe Prentice, 17 for 300 yards and 2 touchdowns. So wide receivers, I would give the group edge to Alabama, but I think a real X factor that probably doesn't fly too under the radar, but I think maybe doesn't get as much credit as he deserves for Michigan is Colston Loveland. I think he is really going to be dangerous in this game. He's had some games where he goes off. I think maybe he has a couple games where he's caught near or over 100 yards in a game. So I think he'll be key in this one. If you have a Dallas Turner, coming in, rushing the quarterback, that maybe creates an opportunity for a quick drop-off pass to Loveland, over the middle, or maybe a slant or something like that can create, big yardage potentially. So going over then back to the defense, I think the secondary, the edges to Michigan. I think the linebacker edge, Michael Barrett, Junior Colson are 2 phenomenal linebackers. I would give it maybe mostly because of Turner, but Lawson and Marshall are both very strong as well. I'd give linebacker edge to Alabama. And I think defensive line, I would give a very slight edge to Alabama. I think the defense as a whole, just how as they work together as a collective unit, I would put Michigan ahead. That shows statistically and what they achieve on the field. But in terms of, each of these position groups, Alabama obviously has a bit more of an edge. But I think the cohesion of the defense is unparalleled with Michigan. So final thing, as this video has probably gone on for a little bit, but one thing I haven't talked about in other games, because it's not often a thing that I want to spend too much time on, but obviously the kicking game, special teams is also important. James Turner for Michigan is 16 for 18 on field goals this year. He's 3 of 4 on 50 plus and 3 of 4 on 40 to 49, and so he's perfect anything inside of 40. And then Will Reichard is 3 for 3 from 50 plus, which is very efficient, and 7 for 10, 40 to 49. So not quite as efficient this season from kind of that mid to long range field goals. So if it comes down to a kick, percentage-wise, they're about even. Sure, Reichard's missed one more, but he's also kicked 5 more field goals. So if it comes down to a kick, I think both teams are fairly even. It does show, though, if that field goal is within, if it's right around 40 to 49 yards, I'm putting my money on Turner for Michigan. If it comes down to, a game-winning field goal attempt, I mean, we saw that in the Peach Bowl last year with Ohio State when that kick was right at 50 yards and it went wide left. Wasn't even close. So if it comes down to a kick, I would put my money slightly more on Turner, but he's obviously had a lot more kicks inside of 30 because he's had 8 from 40 or more. Reichard has had 13. You've heard all the breakdown. Again, this video is probably going pretty long. Yeah, I'm looking over here. It's about 20. I'm probably going to maybe try to trim this down a little bit. But if you stuck around to this point in the video, you're probably wanting to hear my prediction. And one other thing that I haven't mentioned that I think will ultimately be the decider in this game is coaching. At this moment right now, because of the stuff off the field and because of where he's taking this Michigan football team, Harbaugh is at the pinnacle, or probably near the pinnacle of the top coaches in college football. You have to look at Kirby Smart, who won back-to-back titles at Georgia and probably will have the Bulldogs right back into the playoff next year, especially in an expanded field. But Harbaugh is right there in terms of what he's been able to do. However, the one thing Michigan has not been able to do, same as Ohio State in the last several years, the Big Ten teams as a whole, obviously Ohio State and Michigan leading the way, is winning a college football playoff game. Ohio State hasn't done that since 2014, and Michigan has not done it in their 2 appearances the last 2 years. So there's that. And then on the other side, you have a coach in Nick Saban that when his unit, both sides of the ball and special teams is playing at their best, they are a freight train. And, I know the reaction to seeing that they'd play Alabama was probably overblown. I don't think the Michigan players, they're not scared to play Alabama by any means, but I think there was a little bit of maybe a look into how they feel about this matchup, that there's a little bit of hesitancy heading into this game. I think once they really get into practice and they are able to take a look at what this Alabama team does, look at maybe a couple of weaknesses, things that they can exploit, I think their confidence will be there. I don't doubt that. I think Alabama, though, is, nobody wants to play an Alabama team that is clicking when you come to postseason play. And so because of that, I think Alabama makes a few more plays on offense. They probably struggle at times to score a little bit. And I think maybe a sack by Dallas Turner or a pass batted away or intercepted by Terry and Arnold ultimately is the difference. And I think just the experience that Saban has in these big games will pay off. I think Michigan gets even closer than they've been. They lost to Georgia by 23. They lost to TCU by 6. I think this one, is maybe it does come down to a Reichard field goal. So I'm going to go with Alabama 31, Michigan 28. And so the Crimson Tide going back to the national championship game, once again, returning there after a few years away. But that's it for this video. I know it's gone on a little bit longer, so if you stuck around, thank you for taking the time to watch. And I wish you and yours, if you're probably when this goes live, it might be after Christmas. So I hope you had a fantastic, wonderful Christmas day, and wish you all a Happy New Year as well. But again, thank you so much for taking the time. If you enjoyed this video, please feel free to leave a like. Consider subscribing to the channel and turn on those post notifications so you're always up to date. But that's all for College Football Talk. I'm your host, Peter Burtnett, signing out. Peace.